We are so happy to be able to welcome here today Jim Wallace, who is a development associate with Kentucky Historical Society in Frankfort, Kentucky. And Jim, you've been there for 35 years. That is just a wonderful career. We've known one another for quite a long time. And you've been so helpful for so many projects all throughout the state, and I'm certain we're going to hear about many of those. Can I ask you, first of all, what are your first memories of becoming interested in history?
Well, I was very fortunate. Like so many people involved in history, it's usually your parents who introduce you to family stories, or they take you to interesting destinations. My father was in the military. He was in the Judge Advocates Corps, and he was required during the summers to travel all over the United States, and he would take us. So we would go to Gettysburg or Yorktown or Shiloh National Battlefield Park. And I think the earlier a young person has that kind of exposure, the more likely they are to develop an interest. The other thing was he had a tremendous collection of World War I vintage antique soldiers that he had played with when he was a little boy. So my twin brother and I would set up these little doughboys and tanks and all this stuff. And so, I mean, we were just surrounded by it at multiple levels, you know. My grandmother used to get the albums down, and she had been raised in Cincinnati and St. Louis, and we'd look through the pictures. And so I think it was the family heritage, probably.
This is a very interesting thing because I think everyone I'm interviewing has these fond memories of their childhood and of someone, you know, whether it be a grandmother or a father, a mother, a school teacher. And that really does underscore, doesn't it, for us, how important it is for us who work in public history to make certain that we engage the young people, the K through 12. Audience.
Absolutely. The younger, the better. If they can have an aha moment that's a family moment, either based on their family stories or their community history, you've got a much better chance of developing a lifelong interest in history.
Well, that is fantastic. Where did you attend college, and what was your major?
Well, I started at the University of Louisville in the mid-1970s and did a year there, and then transferred to Morehead State University. Finished a BA in history and radio and television.
Radio and television.
Exactly. I thought I was going to be this drive time guru, and but I found out I have no aptitude for technology. I kept blowing the station off the air, and but you know, it actually was a good combination because you had to learn to speak in front of people. You had to learn to be comfortable in settings where you were the focus of attention, and all that sort of served me well, both in my work at the Society and my work as a fundraiser on behalf of the Society. Got the BA at Morehead, and then I went to UK at night and did a master's. It took me 9 years to do that because I was working during the days, and so I finished up a master's at UK in the early 1990s.
Now, who did you work with at UK? You were especially interested, if I recall, in agricultural history.
Dr. David Hamilton was one of my gurus. Dan Smith was another one. And I did a piece for the Register on agricultural history, particularly antebellum era agricultural history, and I did a few articles for various and sundry encyclopedias, as you well know, both the Kentucky and the Northern Kentucky Encyclopedia, and ultimately, the vast bulk of my work was done on African American history in the mid-20th century, particularly the impact of urban renewal upon small rural southern communities.
That is an amazing story, and that is a story that the Kentucky Heritage Council is wanting to look at, just communities in general, both African American small rural communities, but rural communities in general, because we've seen that so many people have migrated to the cities, to the Golden Triangle, to Lexington, to Northern Kentucky, and to the other point of the Golden Triangle, Louisville. And we really see a depopulation in a lot of these small communities, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the unintended consequences of urban renewal was this sort of diaspora of the African American communities, often long-term, well-established communities, were destroyed in what the general public thought was a very good thing of, you know, sort of revitalizing the housing stock, revitalizing downtowns, and all these established communities were just scattered, and people really lost their connection to their families and friends, and oftentimes people they had seen every day of their lives left because their housing was bought out and destroyed, and they never saw those people again. So, I mean, yes, it had some benefits, but there was a real emotional consequence for a lot of those folks. So, yeah, it's a fascinating subject.
So you finished off, and while you were working on your master's, you were where were you working then? What you worked in the evening on your master's?
Ironically, about the same time I started on the master's, I got on at the Kentucky Historical Society, a state agency, as an administrative intern, and started there through the intern program, and they hired me after the internship was done, and I finished both my BA and my master's while a full-time employee at the Kentucky Historical Society, and I really started in their field services section. That's the unit of the agency that really goes out and supports local museums, local historical societies, archival groups, and provides technical support, that kind of thing. But I've held, I think, 6 different jobs there over the 30-plus years that I've worked in support of that agency.
Well, you are living proof of the fact that internships are very, very important. Especially they give you an opportunity as a student when you're an intern to see, is this really what I want to do with my life? Is this something I want to engage in? And it gives the organization, in this case, the Kentucky Historical Society, the opportunity to check out who's out there and what their talents are, to kind of train you in their institutional culture. And then they were obviously very impressed, so they hired you. So it was a win-win on both sides. I think sometimes we don't realize, sometimes when we start out as interns and either they're non-paid or they're lowly paid interns, low paid, and I did enough of those, especially the volunteer ones, that somehow that's not going to benefit us, but it really does benefit us, because besides knowing what you know, it does help to know people and to learn from them and to be mentored from them.
Right. It's excellent networking experience. It provides a valuable source of labor for historical organizations and museums, because the quality of work that interns can do is really exceptional. So we were blessed. We still have a very active paid internship program, and we get young people from all over the state. We've had a couple of NKU students as interns, and so strongly encourage your students to consider an internship experience if at all possible.
Well, that is really a very important thing to understand. So you've been at the Historical Society for 35 years, and you said you've had 6 different roles. Are there any of them that you know were your favorite roles?
Well, I guess the outreach. Oftentimes, I was raised in Jefferson County, and oftentimes, if you're raised in an urban area like that, sometimes you don't really get out and experience the state as a whole. So my job entailed me going to all corners of the state, working in support of community-based history organizations. I really got to know Kentucky and got to know my state much better than I would have otherwise. The job I held the longest, I was the number 2 person at the agency. I was the assistant director. That capacity led me to oversee the budgets, the personnel, all of the interface with state government, which is highly political kind of thing, appearing in front of the General Assembly and legislative committees. And it was probably the best compensated work I did there at the society. So I was assistant director for 16 years.
Oh, that is a long time. So you've worn many hats while you were at the Kentucky Historical Society, and it's interesting that you talk not only about the outreach, which many public historians need to do, but at some point in time, it seems like we all have to pay our dues, so to speak, to be administrators. They recognized obviously administrative talents in you, and they capitalized on that and said that this is a person who's dedicated to the Historical Society. Was it difficult for you to learn all of these systems of budgeting and so forth? It was kind of learning on the job, I assume.
Oh, quite so. Absolutely. But I would encourage your students, if any of them could consider developing a minor in business or perhaps marketing, if they have skills, technology-based skills. So much of what we're doing now is online. Oftentimes the public's first encounter with an institution is when they Google you, and they either go out to your website or they check to see if you're on YouTube. Uh, or, as a young professional, as a public historian, you'd better know how to appreciate digital content, how to create it, how to make sure that you understand the importance of access to content, because so many cases folks won't come on site unless they can find you online and they're intrigued by your online presence. Then they might check out your real-time presence.
So it's interesting because you said you had been in radio and television and that you didn't consider yourself an electronic kind of guru. But now, after all of these years working with the Kentucky Historical Society and making it one of the more connected state historical societies in the country, how you reiterate what we've been reading and what I've been trying to tell students of how important that is to engage the audience. I've said many times to students, I suppose that sometime back in the past when they invented literally old-fashioned chalkboards, that there must have been some people saying, now this is just the most horrible thing to happen to education. But what you are doing and always have done is education. But your education covers everybody from children all the way up through senior adults. How does the Kentucky Historical Society engage all of those different audiences?
Well, it's interesting that you should ask that question, because you're absolutely right. Our early education programs start with kindergarten age. We do a day camp called Camp Artifact, and we use the content of history to develop what we call 21st century skills. Anybody in the educational field will know if you can critically think, if you can collaborate, if you can communicate effectively in writing and orally, all those kind of skills can be developed by using the history content as the base. So we start with Camp Artifact. We have numerous programs for elementary, middle, and high school through National History Day, which we partner with Northern on that, as you're aware of. And then college level, we have fellowships for established scholars as well as new scholars. We actually pay young people, and folks come from all over the world to do this, to use our collections to produce new scholarship and to publish, as well as have college interns. So it's the entire, really pre-K through adult continuum, using Kentucky history really to do skills development, to get people to be more reflective. As you know, Paul, we use the past as a tool to help us craft a better future. We wouldn't be in this game unless we thought history was important to building a better future, to perspective, to dialogue, to wrestle with the tough issues from the basis of the wisdom of previous generations. So we see ourselves as a font of dialogue for important conversations. That's the kind of thing, that's why I'm excited about what I do. It's not just to, save dates and names and the dry bones of the past, but to apply that past toward a better future for Kentucky and our nation.
That was brilliant. You said not just the dry bones of the past, because as so many people have to say in public history, we need to make this come alive. We need to relate. And that means we have to have age-appropriate materials to do that. And you've described some of the fantastic programs that deal with all the different age groups. But we're also very, I think, blessed in the state of Kentucky because we have one of the oldest state historical society journals, scholarly journals around. It's been, what, over 100 years?
Yeah, I think it's like 1903 or 4. I don't remember the exact. It's the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, which I believe is the last historical journal within Kentucky that's devoted solely to Kentucky. There are other journals, but the Register is sort of the premier source of Kentucky history-based scholarly research. And we're really proud of that. And I think Nelson Dawson and Daryl Meadows and those guys do a great job.
Oh, it is a fantastic. It is a quarterly. Yeah. And over 100 years old, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. It's a wonderful vehicle to submit scholarly articles to. You've had fantastic editors like the dean, literally, of Kentucky history, James Clotter.
Dr. Clotter.
And after he retired, you had some other editors, and now you have Nelson Dawson, who was with the Filson Club
Right.
Historical Quarterly, which is no longer. The Filson Club in Louisville and the Cincinnati Historical Society have combined efforts and are now publishing Ohio Valley History. But this shows you what some historical societies have had to resort to in an era of budget cutting and in an era where things have changed. Now, you also have another publication called Kentucky Ancestors, which has been extremely popular with genealogists and used to be published in paper form, but you've recently taken it and put it into electronic format.
Exactly. We're in the midst of that transition now during the last few months of 2013. You'll be able to go to our website, history.ky.gov, and you'll go to a portal, a Kentucky genealogy portal. And the same kind of content that used to come out in print will be available through the portal, which we hope will be a much more interactive experience for people researching family history to use the portal to gain access to the content, but also to interact with our staff and to allow them to help them in their research. So that transition will not actually be completed to early 2014. And in a way, you're absolutely right, Paul, that the cost of producing these printed quarterlies had gotten to the point where it was almost prohibitive. And so many folks now, even senior citizens, are much more comfortable with an online presence. And so I'm really hopeful we'll pick up a whole new market segment, as well as retain the folks who are already enjoying the printed version of the publication.
How very important genealogy is. Sometimes in years past, and 20, 30 years ago, we would sometimes, pre-Ancestry.com days, sometimes discount genealogy as professional historians. And that was really very wrong of many professional historians to do, because our local communities are made up of the stories of families. And the wonderful thing about the electronic age is vehicles like Ancestry.com and now vehicles like Kentucky Ancestors, where people can be anywhere in the world and literally look up. And this is not only useful for your own family, but this is useful for research on even important individuals. So much of my research, which is local, would have been impossible 10 years ago. Or before at least the internet and all of these internet sources. There's no way that I could have traveled all around the country, and there's no way I would have known that some of these sources exist. So that is just, I think, an amazing thing that you've been able to do. So how have you've been there 35 years, how have historical societies, state and local, changed during the past 35 years?
There's a much greater emphasis on making content available virtually through online experiences. As you just described, the digitization of content, whether it's oral history interviews or paper materials, or even creating 3D versions of artifacts. People today want to encounter a historical organization on their own time and on their own terms, which often that initial encounter is an online encounter. So if you're not doing social media, if you're not creating digital content, you're sort of dead in the water. In the old days, people would come, you were sort of the mecca. People would come to you to have access to the content, whether that content found expression in exhibits or published articles or in your research library. So the on-site experience was sort of the alpha and the omega. That's no longer the case. On-site visitation is only one small slice of the kind of interaction you're trying to create. You've got to reach out and meet people where they're at, whether it's virtually through digitized content, or you're going out into their communities, their schools, their community festivals, and taking the materials to them. And I think the other thing you got to do is the content itself is not solely compelling. The content has to be a path toward either skills development or some type of real-world application of the content to the issues and concerns that people wrestle with on a day-to-day basis. In other words, how can we use the history that is around us to make a better tomorrow for our Kentucky communities? So, in other words, access, the way we access the content, and what we're doing with it have evolved to a different level.
Two different questions arise listening to you, Jim, on that. And one is, of course, you have the Thomas D. Clark Center, this beautiful museum and center with a library and all kinds of things in downtown, on Broadway in Frankfurt, which has been a mecca for years and years, and interactive exhibits. It's just a marvelous place to visit. We see over time, these kind of ups and downs. It's sort of like a roller coaster with museums. Sometimes, you see the school visits and just visits by others go up. Sometimes you see them go down. I know for a while we were concentrating on the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math, we saw in many museums sort of a decline in visitation, especially school visits. And especially, I think, when the recession hit and we were concentrating more on high-stakes testing. But it seems that we've turned a corner, maybe, that we're looking now nationwide at the Common Core, and the liberal arts are back in the Common Core. Critical thinking is one of those Common Core items, and we have done, I think, perhaps maybe a turnaround, possibly, in on-site visitation as well.
I think we're in the earliest phases of a national awakening to the importance of the humanities, both as a tool, actually a workforce development tool. You think of the kinds of skills that employers desire: effective, efficient oral and written communication, critical thinking skills, able to work in teams, collaboratively, creativity. And a lot of that comes through exposure to the humanities. There was a recent national commission on the humanities, and the analogy they used is this: they showed this picture of a beautiful flower, and the stem, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, is important. But at the top of the stem is the blossom, and that is the humanities. And I think you're right. People and the public as a whole are seeing the role that history can play in informing dialogue around critical issues that we're all wrestling with. Why don't we draw on the wisdom of previous generations to use and apply it toward contemporary, compelling, and enduring concerns? We're foolish not to do that, and I think the public is waking up to the role of history in helping us create a better tomorrow.
And as an associate director and in being involved for so many years with the Kentucky General Assembly and others in government, convincing them that yes, Kentucky Historical Society is a responsible and valuable tool of education for Kentuckians of all ages, but especially for school children. You've never lost, and perhaps that's the reason why the Kentucky Historical Society, in contrast to some other state historical societies, has been so much more successful, is you've never lost sight of the fact that we do need to be accountable. We do need to keep those conversations constantly going with legislators and others, and we need to show we need to also measure. Right now you can measure the number of people that visit your website and go back to the state and say, well, we not only have all of these people visiting our museum and all of these subscribers to our journals, but we also have all of these people visiting our websites, and we did all of this outreach, and we sent the Kentucky History Mobile so many different places. So you literally must be sometimes drowning in statistics, but those are very valuable to keep, to see where an organization is going and how it can show it's using tax dollars and other federal dollars, grant dollars effectively.
Right. If you're not data driven, you're really in trouble. Not only the data in the sense of how many programs you've conducted or the level of usage of your services, but the outcomes of how you're affecting the lives of students and teachers and researchers. You really have to track your impact in a way that has meaning to the funders. In our case, when the recession started, we had about a $9 million budget and 94 employees. Now, on almost the other side of this thing, we're down to a $5 million budget and 54 employees. So our whole business model is having to evolve, Paul, and Much of what the public utilizes now in the way of services and programming all comes from public dollars. And you sit down with, say, a business corporation, a U.S. bank, a city bank, you sit down with a foundation like the Hale Foundation or the James Graham Brown Foundation, you'd better have data to show the impact of what you're doing, because that's what they're tracking, and that's what they use to make decisions about whether or not they invest in you. I think that's the biggest change I've seen at our institution in the last 20 years, is the level of private sector investment that is required to support the mission is an ever-growing component of your budget. And with that comes the obligation and the opportunity to demonstrate impact. And if you can't do it, you're really constrained as to how many investors will look at you and say, yeah, I think this is something that I think we ought to invest money in. Because I don't think the public sector is ever going to get back to the point where at one point in time 90% of our budget was taxpayer money. Now it's more like 70 to 75%, and we've got to find the difference. Without the data, hard to sell what you do as being a compelling investment.
Interesting, because as a state university, we've seen the same things happen in the past 10 to 15 years. Those numbers, those percentages that you're talking about in terms of state money have, in fact, we're probably, I heard, even below 70% now state money. So we're more tuition driven, we're more driven based upon grants and upon donations of alumni, of businesses, of foundations. And I think we would all like to go back to those halcyon days of being able to kind of just accept the tax dollars. But in essence, it sort of makes us work, I think, that much harder and try to develop plans, future plans, 5-year plans, to learn what the competition literally is doing. Friendly competition, though it may be, to learn what they're doing and to never really become complacent. And I think the Kentucky Historical Society has never become complacent and hence has never become mediocre. Some other historical societies out there have allowed themselves to say, we are really good at what we do. We don't need to change anything. And then a complacency and a mediocrity and a decline will set in. So we've always got to be kind of like baseball players or football players at the top of our game at all times. What do you see as the future of state historical societies and museums? Do you see a bright future there, albeit a different one?
Yeah, I actually do. Much of why I do is what you just articulated a few minutes ago. I do think there is a national awakening to the importance of history. People want to be connected to place. They want to be connected to their families. So I think the interest inherently is there. The other thing is I do see state historical societies becoming more nimble, not only investing in technology, but I'll give you some examples here. Much of the content that is possessed by museums throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky and local historical societies is not readily known to folks who would love to use it, like teachers or tourists or heritage tourism, that type of thing. We are creating an online platform called iKentucky that has a mechanism to work with community historical societies so they can digitize and upload their content. Has a portal for teachers to use when they're creating local history units for use in their classroom. Then they'll have the content that's accessible to them via the iKentucky platform. They'll be able to network with other teachers around the state who might have an interest in the same time periods they are. In other words, state historical societies, the better ones, are becoming the common grounds, the nexus for bringing together the folks who want to find access to content and those who have it. And it's sort of this meeting grounds, I guess, is what we're brokering relationships and getting people to have access to the kinds of historical imagery, special collections, and materials that they wouldn't otherwise even know existed. So I'm encouraged. I think we're in the sort of the front end of one of the biggest transitions that's going on in the historical world. But it's really exciting for your students, particularly those that have the technology skills and who are really willing to take some non-traditional roles. Sort of sequestering yourself in a library and doing nothing but research is a luxury that very few people have anymore. Almost all of us are doing either marketing or fundraising or technology development. so that whole suite of skills has to change. But if you're willing to bring those tools to the table, you can have an exciting career in history, and I think state historical societies are bringing those kind of people into the fold and reinventing themselves to be at the heart of the dialogue about the future of the Commonwealth and our nation. So, yeah, I'm optimistic, very much so.
Well, this has been a pleasure talking with you today, and to see the optimism in all of this. I know that you are the kind of person that is not afraid of embracing the future. So many museums and historical societies have said, well, if we put something online, they won't come to see it. And we know now, especially with young people and children, that they still want to come and see it. They want to look at it. They want to see it in person. They want to touch it if they can. We can't always allow them to do that, but at least being able to say, you know, I saw that document by Daniel Boone. And, you know, we still have a great deal, too, of poverty in Kentucky. And, you know, Kentucky, relatively speaking, is a poor state. And we have poverty all throughout the United States. But there are ways that we as institutions can reach children who would not ordinarily be able to come to a place like Frankfurt. And I hope that we constantly continue to enrich them and give everybody, no matter what they are in terms of class, the opportunity to engage in what is just as much their heritage as our heritage. We are not the protectors of this heritage, are we? We are engaging people to experience the heritage ourselves.
Right. We're ambassadors. We're envoys. We're that link between the heritage and their interests. Well, like you mentioned earlier, the Histromobile that goes out all over the state, big tractor trailer rig. It's a mobile museum. The current one is on the Civil War. And we take the lives of 8 historic figures in Kentucky's Civil War era history, and we present the kids with the opportunity to explore all the choices these people had to make as they negotiated one of the most difficult chapters of Kentucky's history. Or we go into the classroom with the National History Day program and work with teachers and students where young people can explore local topics that link back to a national theme, and they create exhibits, they create websites, they do dramas and productions. In other words, we're reaching out to kids all over the state and trying to get them excited and involved, because I think what will happen, you have to care about your story and your family's story. You have to see how that fits into your community story. And once you make all those connections, you invest your pride and your identity in your hometown. And it's those kind of people who will work for a better future for their towns and their communities. So, I mean, we got to get them while they're young, and I don't really care what social class or economic class they come from. History has a real power to invigorate and energize people to do a better job of building a brighter future for Kentucky, and that's part of our job. So that's why we're optimistic. You're absolutely right. History, it's not the universal antidote, but it's a good medicine to get people to care about tomorrow and care about a better Kentucky.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Jim, and we wish you well in your continued employment and all of your work and dedication to the Kentucky Historical Society.
Well, thanks, Paul. It's been a lot of fun.